I worked in Gramps' shop for most of my life. It's been the first job for not just me, but all my siblings and most of my cousins. Grandpa runs a little pawn shop downtown, the kind of place that sells antiques as well as modern stuff. And he does pretty well. I don't think I've ever seen him worry about paying rent or that he can afford to pay us kids better than any other place in the neighborhood. All the other kids quit on it after a while, but I enjoyed the work, and Grandpa always said I had a real knack for it. You keep at it, kid. Someday this old shop will be yours. Grandpa and I live above the shop. He offered me the spare room after Grandma died a few years back. It's been a pretty good arrangement. Every evening he turns on the radio, cracks a beer, we sit around, we drink. He tells me stories from back in the day. The radio never seemed to make any noise. I always asked him why he kept it around. Told me it was something that he'd had for a long time and that it was special. I asked how the old radio was special. He said that was a long story. If I had the time for it, I said. I didn't have anything else to do but sit here, listen to the rain, and Grandpa settling in as the old thing clicked and clunked in the background. Grandpa grew up in the early 60s. I mean, technically, he grew up in the 40s and 50s, but in a lot of his stories, it doesn't really seem like his life began until 1962. He describes it as one of the most interesting times of his life, and a lot of it's because of his father, my great-grandpa. He grew up in Chicago, and the town was just starting to get its feet under it after years of war and strife. His mother had died when he was 14, and his father opened a pawn shop with the money that he had gotten from her life insurance policy. But they weren't called pawn shops at that point. I think Grandpa said what my great-grandfather had was a brokerage or something. But all that mattered was that people came in and they tried to sell him strange and wondrous things sometimes. Well, great-grandpa had run the place with his family, which consisted of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-uncle Terry. Great-great-grandma lived with him, but she didn't help out around the shop much. She had dementia, so she mostly stayed upstairs in her room as she knitted and waited to die. They lived above the shop in a little 3-bedroom flat. It was a little tight, Grandpa said, but they did all right. Grandpa worked at the pawn shop since he needed money to pay for his own apartment. And he said they got some of the strangest things sometimes, especially if his Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was an odd duck, and that's coming from a family that wasn't quite strictly normal. Now, Dad usually buy things he knew he could sell easily. Appliances, tools, cars, furniture, that sort of thing. Uncle Terry, however, he would often buy things that were a little less easy to move. He bought a bunch of old movie props once from a guy who claimed they were genuine props from an old Bela Lugosi film. Dad lost his shit on them. Uncle Terry was also the one who bought that jewelry. Turned out to be stolen. Well, that was okay. As they turned it into the police, the reward was worth way more than they had spent on it. Terry was like a metronome. He'd make the worst choices, and then the best choices. And sometimes, they were the same choices all at once. So, of course, Terry had been the one who bought the radio. Well, Dad had been sick about a week. It had been bad enough the family had worried that he might not come back from it. Now, people in those times, they didn't always get over illness. Unless you had money to go see a doctor, you either got better or you didn't. He finally hacked it all up and got better and was ready to return to work, so he comes downstairs to the floor where Terry's sitting there and reading some kind of artsy-fartsy magazine. He looks over and sees they've taken a new radio. It was this big old German model, dark wood cabinet and dials. Looked like they were out of Frankenstein's lab. He thinks that looks pretty good, and he congratulates Terry, telling him everybody wants a good radio. Now it'll be real easy to sell. Now Terry looks over his magazine, tells him it ain't a radio. Dad asks him what the hell it is then. But Terry lays down the magazine, gives him the biggest, creepiest grin you've ever seen. It's a spirit radio, Terry announces like it's supposed to mean something. Now, I was working when Dad and Uncle Terry had that conversation. Dad just pinched the bridge of his nose, shook his head like he was trying not to bash Terry's skull in. After buying a bunch of counterfeit movie props, the guy that Dad didn't even need an expert to tell him were fake, Uncle Terry had been put on a strict $100 a month budget of things that he could buy for the shop. Anything over $100 he had to go talk to Dad about. Dad hadn't had any visits from Uncle Terry, other than to bring him food in the last week. Dad knew that it either had cost less than $100 or Uncle Terry hadn't asked. How much this thing costs, Terry? Dad asked, clearly expecting to be angry. Now, Terry seemed to hedge a little. Nothing, Brian. The thing will pay for itself by the end of the month. You'll see, I'll show you the thing really is. How much? My dad asked, making it sound like a threat. $500. But, Brian, I've already made back $200 of that. Give me another week and I'll... But Dad had heard enough. You spent $500 on this thing. It better be gold-plated because $500 is a lot of money for a damn radio. Now, Terry tried to explain, but Dad wasn't having any of it. He told Terry to get out of the shop for a while. Otherwise, he's probably going to commit fratricide. And Terry suddenly remembered a friend that he had to see and made himself scarce. Then Dad rounds on me like I had something to do with it. And he asked how much Terry really spent on that thing. I told him he actually spent about $550 on it. Dad asked why in heaven's name no one had consulted him before spending such an astronomical sum. Now, the truth of the matter was, I was a little spooked by the radio. The guy had brought it in on a rainy afternoon, Dolly covered in an old blanket. And when he wheeled it up to the counter, I had come to see what he'd brought. And Terry was already there, reading, doing a lot of nothing. And he had perked up when the old guy told him that he had something miraculous to show him. I didn't care much for the old guy myself. He sounded foreign, East-West German. And his glass eye wasn't fooling anybody. So he whipped the quilt off the cabinet like a showman doing a trick, and there was a spirit radio, humming placidly before the front desk. Uncle Terry asked him what it was. The man said he'd be happy to demonstrate. So he took out a pocket knife, cut his finger, sprinkling the blood into a bowl of crystal on top of it, and the blood fell on the rocks. The dials began to glow, and the thing hummed to life. Uncle Terry had started to tell the man that he didn't have to do that, but as it glowed and crooned, protest died on his lip. Spirit radio, man said. Who will win tomorrow's baseball game? The Phillies, the box intoned in a deep and unsettling voice. They'll defeat the Cubs 9-7. Uncle Terry looked ready to buy it on the spot, but when he asked what the man wanted for it, he balked a little at the price. Well, they dickered back and forth nearly an hour until they finally settled on $550. I could see Dad getting mad again, so I told him the rest of it too. Terry isn't wrong either. He's been using that spirit radio thing to bet on different stuff. The Phillies actually did win the game the next day, 9-7. And he's been making bets and collecting debts ever since. He's paid the store back $200. But I know he's won more than that. His dad still looked mad. But he looked intrigued, too. Dad didn't put a lot of stock in weirdness, but he understood money. I saw him look at the spirit radio, look at the bowl of crystal on top of it. When he dug out his old buck knife, I turned away before I could see him slice himself. He grunted and squeezed a few drops over the bowl. When the radio purred to life, I turned back to see it glowing. And an eerie blue glow. The dials softly admitting light through foggy glass, and it always made me shiver and I watched it. And to this day, I think those were spirits, ghosts, of those who had used it, but who knows. Dad hesitated, maybe sensing what I had sensed too, and when he spoke, his voice quavered for the first time that I could remember. Who'll win the first raise at the dog track tomorrow? Yeah. The radio softly hummed, and contemplated, and finally whispered, Mama's boy will win the first race of the day at Olsen Park track tomorrow. And Dad rubbed his face, and I hear a scrub of stubble on his palm. He thought about it, resting a hand on the box. I went to the register to see what we had made while he was gone. When Uncle Terry came back, Dad handed him an envelope, told him to shut up when he tried to explain himself. He said, you'll be at Olsen Park track tomorrow for the first race. You'll take the money in the envelope. And I'll bet every cent of it on Mama's boy to win the first race. And you'll bring me all the winnings back. And if you lose that money, I'll put this thing in the window. I'll sell it as a regular radio, and you'll never be allowed to purchase anything for the shop again. He said, and if he wins? And Terry had asked, but Dad didn't answer. Grandpa took a sip of his beer then and got a faraway look as he contemplated. That was just how Grandpa told stories. He always looked like he was living in the times when he was talking about. And I suppose in a lot of ways he was. Going back to the 1960s. The most interesting time of his young life. To a time when he encountered something he couldn't quite explain. So, did he win? I asked. He invested now as we sat in the apartment above the shop, drinking beer and watching it rain. Oh yeah, Grandpa said. He won. And when Uncle Terry came back with the money, I think Dad was as surprised as Terry was. Terry had been using it, but it always felt like he was operating on the idea that it was some kind of monkey's paw situation. After a while, there'd be an accounting for what he had won. When a month went by, however, and there was no downside to using the radio, Terry got a bit more comfortable. He started asking other things, the results of boxing matches, horse race, sporting events, and anything else that he could use to make money. It got so bad that his fingers started to look like a pin cushion. Started cutting into his palms, his arms. Seemed like more blood equaled better results, and sometimes you could get a play-by-play if you bled more for it. Dad would use it sparingly, still not liking to give it its blood. But Uncle Terry was adamant about it. There was a mania in him, and even though it hurt him, he used it a lot. He could always be seen hanging around the radio, talking to it and feeding it. Dad didn't like the method, but he liked the money it brought in. Now, the shop was doing better than ever, thanks to the cash injection from the spirit radio. And Dad was buying better things to stock it with. He bought some cars, luxury electronics. There was always a net gain to the store once they sold. Times were good. Everyone was doing well. That's when Uncle Terry took it too far. He brought the bottle to his mouth, but didn't quite make it. It seemed to get stuck halfway there, the contents spilling on his undershirt as he watched the rain. He jumped when the cold liquid touched him and righted it, putting it down before laughing at himself. He shook the drops off his shirt and looked back at the rain, running his tongue over his dry lips. One night we tied on a few too many. My uncle, he had this really serious look in his face. He staggered downstairs despite Dad yelling at him, asking where he was going. When he started yelling, we ran downstairs to see what was going on, and we leaned over to the spirit box, tip of his finger dribbling as he yelled at it. He held it out, and the blood fall into the crystal dish on top of the radio as it came to life. He put his ruddy face very close to the wooden cabinet and blistered out his question, clearly not for the first time. When will I die? The radio was silent, lights blinking, but it didn't return an answer. He cut another finger asking the same question, but it never returned an answer. Before we could stop it, he split his palm almost to the wrist as the blood dribbled into the stone. He nearly screamed his question at it. When will I die? Spirit radio still said nothing. And Dad and I had to restrain him before he could do it again. Now, we don't know what brought this on. We never found out. But Uncle Terry became very interested in death. More specifically, when he was going to die. I don't know, maybe all this spirit talk got him thinking. Maybe he was afraid that one day his voice was going to come out of that radio. Whatever the case, Dad put a stop to using it. He hid the thing. He had to keep moving it because Uncle Terry always found it again. He'd hide it for a day or two, but eventually we'd find him, bleeding from his palms, pressing his face against it. Sometimes I could hear him whispering to it like it was talking back to him. I didn't like those times. It was creepy. But Uncle Terry was attached to it at the hip. It went on for about a month, and Uncle Terry did something unforgettable. And he got his answer. He watched the rain for a moment longer, his teeth chattering a little as he was trying to get the sound out of his head. Grandpa didn't much care for the rain. I had known him to close the shop if it got really bad, and it always seemed to make him extremely uncomfortable. That's why we're sitting up here in the first place, and I believe that Grandpa would have liked to be drinking something a little stronger. Dad and I got a call about something big, something he always wanted. It was an old armoire, antique from the Civil War era. The guy selling it, at least according to Dad, is asking way less than it was worth. He wanted me to come along to help move it, so that he didn't feel like Terry would be any use to it. He'd been flaky lately, obsessed with that damn radio, wouldn't even leave the house. To say that Terry had been flaky was an understatement. Uncle Terry had been downright weird. He never left the shop, just kept looking for the radio. I started to notice a weird smell come around the house. I suspected he wasn't bathing. I never saw him eat or sleep. He just hunted for the radio, fettered his blood when he found it. But Dad had always asked him. Terry said he was busy, so Dad told him to keep an eye on his mother. Mother, my great-great-grandmother, had been suffering from dementia for years. Dad and Uncle Terry decided to keep an eye on her instead, instead of just putting her in a home. And Terry agreed. As we left the house, the rain had started to come down. That's what I always remember about that day. The way the rain came down in buckets, the sky was crying. What was about to happen. We got the armoire into the trailer. The guy had a thick old quilt and put over it to stop it from getting wet. When we got back to the shop, we brought it in and left it in the back room. And Dad was smiling. Knew he had something special here. He was excited to see what he could get for it. We both squished as we went upstairs to get fresh clothes on, joking about the trip until we got to the landing. Dad put out his hand. His nostrils flared as he sniffed. I could smell it too. I couldn't identify it at the time. Dad must have recognized it because he burst into the apartment like a cop looking for dope. Uncle Terry was sitting in the living room, his hands red, his knees getting redder by the minute. He was rocking back and forth, spirit radio glowing beside him. He repeated the same thing over and over again. He had found it whenever Dad had hidden it. He'd clearly been up to his old tricks again. Dad stood over him as he rocked, his fist tightened, like he wanted to hit him. When he growled at him, I took a step away, sensing the rage that was building up there. "What have you done?" he said. "Today. It's today. It's today." Terry kept right on repeating it, rocking back and forth as he sobbed to himself. My Dad turned the bowl on top of the spirit radio. He Not like what you saw. I saw it later, after everything had come next. It was just full of blood. Crystals were swimming in it, practically floating in the thick red blood. Dad seemed to be doing the math. There was more blood than a finger prick or a palm cut. Dad was clearly getting worried, given that Terry was still conscious. He said, "Where's Mom?" His voice low and dangerous. "Today, it's today." "Where's our mother, Terry?" Dad yelled, leaning down to grab him by the collar, pull him up. Uncle Terry had blood on his hands, up to the elbows, but instead of dripping off onto the floor, it stayed caked on him in thick, dry patches. Shaking seemed to have brought him out of his haze. It said if I wanted the answer, I had to sacrifice, Terry said, his voice cracking. It said I had to give up something important if I wanted to know something so important, something I loved. The others weren't enough. I didn't even know them, but my mother was... He stopped. He stopped stammering when Dad wrapped his hands around his throat. He choked him, shook him violently as he screamed wordlessly into his dying face, and when he dropped him, Uncle Terry didn't move. Dad and I just stood there for a second. Dad seemed to remember that I was there at all. When he caught sight of the softly glowing radio, the subject of my uncle's obsession, he pivoted, lifted his foot to kick the thing, and I could tell he meant to destroy it. Did not stop kicking until it was splinters on the floor, but something stopped him. Whether it was regret for what he had done or some otherworldly force, my dad found himself unable to strike the cabinet. Maybe he was afraid of letting the spirits out, and I would never know. Instead, he went to call the police so they could come and collect the bodies. He might also collect him, but he didn't talk about that as we sat in silence until they arrived. Dad told the police my uncle had admitted to killing their mother, and he had killed him in a blind rage. They went to the back room, confirmed my grandmother was dead. Dad didn't tell me until he lay dying of cancer years later, but Terry had cut her heart out. Offered it to the bowl on top of the radio. We assume he did, at least, because we never found any evidence of it in the house or in the bowl. It was never discovered. Police believe it had to have it ground up. They also discovered the bodies of 3 homeless men rotting in the back of Terry's closet. He had bled them. Something that had stained the wood in that room so badly, they had to replace it. How he'd done all that without anyone noticing, we had no idea. He had to have been luring them in while we were out doing other things. And if it hadn't been for my grandmother's death being directly linked to him, I truly believe Dad would have been as much of a suspect as Uncle Terry. And they took the bodies away. They took the bowl away. Well, they returned it later. I ended up moving in with Dad. He got kind of depressed after the whole thing and helped to have someone here with him. I've lived here ever since. Eventually taking over the business. You pretty much know the rest. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the rain come down and the static from the old radio as it crackled amicably. Have you ever used the radio? A little afraid of the answer. Grandpa shook his head. I saw what it did to Uncle Terry and to a lesser degree what it did to my dad. I've run the shop since his death, and I did it without the radio. Then why keep it? I asked, looking at the old thing a little differently now. Oh, because like Dad, I can't bring myself to destroy it. I won't sell it to someone else that can ruin their life too. When the shop's yours, it'll be your burden. Choice of what to do with it'll be up to you. I couldn't help but watch the radio, seeing it differently than I had earlier. As we sat drinking, I thought I could hear something under the sound of rain. It sounded like a low, melancholy moan that came sliding from the speakers like a whispered scream. Was my great-uncle's voice in there? Somewhere? I suppose. One day, I might find out. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video or for listening to tonight's episode of the podcast, wherever you happen to do that. So if it's like on YouTube, then you're probably, watching the video, but if it's on, not, then you're probably listening to the podcast, like with Spotify or with Apple or something like that. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me over at Patreon. That's patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you guys so much for being supporters. That goes for everybody who was down in the description, as well as AcidSystem, BallarmsTheRat, Blake Rattler, Brandon Mendoza, Brenna, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, Chainsmoker Dealer, ChicagoHitman, CoryxKenshin, Cronut508, CrusaderChocobo, CursepoxPrimarch, Dakota Best, Daniel Poulsen, Dante Kinkade, Kraus, Ellie Hutmire, Enchanted Buns, Estebean, Gemma Halsey, HIDive's nephew, himbojerry, Hour Minute Seconds Time, Jay Keems, Jed is Pet, Jordan Humble, King Crab, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Old Penguin, Peaceful Buddha, Psychomel, Red Shadowcat, Remember the Sun, Rinku Star, Salty Surprise, Samara Line, Seclude, Simba's Bloody Mojo, Sky Harbor, Smiley the Psychotic, Sullyman, Charlie Sue, the Chavez Brothers. Thank you so much. And honestly, thank you to everybody, even those guys that are in there for just $1. It really helps me out. Once again, that's patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. Or if you guys like to just listen, honestly, it helps me out a lot too. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And sweet dreams.